Hi everyone, so Andycine was nice enough to send me one of their new C7 monitors to review, and my friend was nice enough to let me have his Atomos Shinobi for this video. Both monitors are in a similar price range and they're both marketed as being bright enough to be used outside, so I thought I'd compare the two. Let's do it. I'll compare the two displays in 15 different categories and always give a point to the monitor, which in my opinion does better in that category. However, if you're watching this video to find out which one of those two displays to buy, I advise you not to make your decision just based on the final score, but based on the categories that matter most to you. If you don't have time to watch the entire video, just pause it right now and have a look at the overview chart. Let's start off with some more general categories like build quality. The Andycine has a couple of buttons which might come in handy, but they do come with the risk of getting broken sooner or later. Both monitors are made out of plastic, however, when holding them in my hands, the plastic on the Shinobi seemed less slippery than that on the Andycine. Looking at the screens themselves, the Andycine shows brighter reflections, and fingerprints show up more easily and are harder to get off. Both monitors run incredibly hot after a while, especially directly on the panel, which makes it uncomfortable to use the touchscreen. All in all, this point goes to the Shinobi. Moving on to power options, the Shinobi can be powered by one Sony L-type NPF battery, which is not included, or by a dummy battery with a DC adapter, which is included. The Andycine can also be powered by an NPF battery or by two NPF batteries simultaneously, which are also not included, or by the included DC cable running into the DC port. So far I'd say that's a draw, however, the Andycine also has a DC out port, so you can power other accessories through the monitor. Therefore, this point goes to the Andycine C7. The result of our power consumption test surprised me a little. We put one fully charged NPF 970 battery in each monitor, and then just let them sit there until they ran out. The C7 gave up after 3 hours and 15 minutes. Now you might think there's probably a reason they put 2 battery slots on this thing. The Shinobi will last twice as long, right? It lasted 3 times as long. I mean, sure, the Andycine is a little bigger and a little brighter, but in my opinion, that doesn't justify this insane difference. A clear point for the Shinobi. Next category, mounting options. The Andycine comes with a cold shoe mounting arm. The Shinobi comes with nothing. The arm is a little weird though, it's very hard to rotate and comes with extremely short screws that make it feel kind of flimsy. The Andycine has 1/4-inch mounts on the bottom and on both sides, although depending on how you mount it, you might end up covering either your DC ports, your power button, your headphone jack, or your SD card port. The Shinobi comes with 1/4-inch mounts only on the top and the bottom, not on the sides, but at least you can't cover anything up. All in all, this point goes to the Andycine. Let's talk signal options. Both monitors have a 3.5mm headphone jack, no difference there, and both monitors can only receive the video signal through HDMI, not through SDI, which may be relevant for professional use, although there is a more expensive SDI version available of both monitors. Both support 4K DCI input up to 60 frames per second, possibly even more, but we couldn't test that because our camera couldn't do it. This is even though both user manuals say they only support up to 30 frames per second, but I suppose that just means that the monitors themselves can't display more than 30 frames per second. In addition to the HDMI input, the C7 also has an HDMI output, So you can loop the signal through, which can be useful, for instance, if you're using the monitor on your camera and you want to transmit the signal wirelessly to an extra director's monitor or something. Therefore, this point again goes to the Andycine C7. Now, let's take them outside, shall we? Both monitors are definitely usable under direct sunlight as advertised. When looking straight at them, they look almost equally bright, which is kind of weird since the Andycine is advertised to have 2200 nits, whereas the Shinobi is advertised to only have 1000 nits. However, when looking at them from an angle, that difference kind of starts to show up. The Shinobi starts getting darker, whereas the Andycine holds up pretty well. On the other hand, as mentioned before, the Andycine shows more reflections, which might be a little distracting. Therefore, I'd say it's a draw. Moving on to menu usability, the Shinobi has less options in general, which makes the menu less cluttered and quicker and easier to use, especially with the very well-designed icons. The C7 has the wheel and the function buttons, so you can make all settings without having to use the touchscreen, which is nice because the monitors, as mentioned before, get so incredibly hot. However, if you want to change some value, you have to turn that wheel forever in order to be able to make big changes. And you can't use the touchscreen to change any values except backlight and volume. So overall, I would say this point goes to the Shinobi. Alright, so that was our general categories. Now, when I use a monitor on my camera, there are 4 different things that I wanted to help me judge. That is framing, focus, exposure, and color. So let's dive into the features that are there to help us judge these things, starting with framing. The Shinobi has more frame guide options for previewing different aspect ratios than the C7. On the other hand, it doesn't offer a grid overlay over the image. Another potentially relevant topic here are safety markers. The Shinobi has the standard SEMPTI safety markers. The Andycine lets you set custom ones, which I personally find a little less useful, since if safety markers are at all still relevant today, I'd like to stick with an established standard. All in all, I would say the category frame guides and grid is a draw. Another thing that you will definitely need if you're working with anamorphic lenses is Desqueeze. Here both monitors have the exact same options, except the Andycine has an additional 1.25x option. Therefore, this point goes to the Andycine. When it comes to judging focus, I think there are 3 relevant categories: focus peaking, sharpness, and screen size. At screen sizes as small as these, 5 inches or 7 inches, it's almost impossible to tell whether something is in focus or not, which is why focus peaking is essential. Both monitors can do contrast-based focus peaking, which basically means that the monitor will draw colored lines around high contrast edges in the image. Since objects that are in focus are more likely to produce such high contrast edges than objects that are not in focus, this can be quite helpful. However, it can also be misleading, since just because there's a high contrast edge in the image doesn't necessarily mean that area of the image is in focus. Both monitors let you customize the color of the lines that they draw around these high contrast edges, and the Shinobi seems to be a little more accurate at doing that. In addition to this, the Shinobi has 2 other focus peaking modes, which, in my opinion, are a lot more useful than this. One of these modes is this black and white mode, which is basically also just contrast-based focus peaking, except it only shows the high contrast edges in white, and the rest of the image just stays black. That way you can really concentrate on what's in focus and nothing else than that. And I find myself being able to pull focus a lot better like this than with the standard colored lines peaking. And then there's another option that simply increases the sharpness of the image areas that are in focus. Now, I'm not sure how exactly this works. It might also be contrast based, but I don't think it is, since high contrast edges that are not in focus don't seem to trigger the peaking in this mode. However, this is also a lot harder to see, but I guess if you've got some practice, this is probably the most accurate mode. Since both of these additional options are only available on the Atomos Shinobi, it definitely gets this point. Another thing that might be relevant for judging focus is the sharpness of the screen itself. Here there doesn't seem to be a noticeable difference between the two, except when you send in a 10 times zoomed in signal. You can see that the Shinobi kind of has the same amount of pixels on a smaller area, which naturally makes it sharper. But since I can't imagine that anybody is going to use their monitor to look at a 10 times zoomed in signal, I would say this is a draw. And then of course there's screen size. Well, you know. When it comes to judging exposure, there are two things that I look for in a monitor: false color and scopes, like waveform, RGB parade, and histogram. Both monitors offer both of these features, so let's jump right in. The false color on the Andycine has an additional option that only shows the outermost luminance levels, which to me seems kinda unnecessary though. The false color on the Shinobi seems quite a bit more detailed. I guess you could say it uses a higher false color bit depth than the C7. The Andycine makes overexposure a little hard to notice because it's only orange, not red. The Shinobi, on the other hand, makes underexposure purple, and it's sometimes kinda hard to tell apart from the blue. Overall, I would give this point to the Shinobi. When it comes to scopes, the Atomos Shinobi also seems to show more details. However, the small screen size makes the scopes a little harder to use in general, especially for just quickly taking a look. The Shinobi lets you change scope types by just touching them, which is much quicker and more intuitive than the cycling through that you have to do on the Andycine. The scope options themselves are pretty much the same on both monitors, except the Shinobi doesn't show the RGB parade in color, which is a little annoying, and it can't show the RGB histogram and the Luma histogram separately. The Andycine, on the other hand, can't show the Luma and RGB in a combined waveform. Neither of the monitors lets you customize the position of the scopes on the screen, which would be nice to have. All in all, I would say this is a draw. Lastly, let's talk about judging color, which is a difficult topic since color perception not only depends on the accuracy of the monitor, but also, and I think a lot more so, on the lighting conditions in the viewing environment. However, it is nice to know that your monitor is color accurate, and that can be achieved either by having a monitor that is accurate out of the box, or by having one that you can calibrate to a certain standard. I will go out on a limb here and say, if you want a monitor that is color accurate out of the box, you'll have to spend some more money. I made some measurements using an X-Rite i1 Display Pro and DisplayCal, and the results didn't surprise me. If you don't know what these values mean, check out the video description. I put a little explanation in there. But yeah, they're both pretty inaccurate, so neither one gets a point. Speaking of calibration, the Andycine can be manually white balanced, either by setting a white point in Kelvin or by setting gain levels on the individual R, G, and B channels. This is definitely a nice feature to have, since a correct white point goes a long way in knowing you're looking at a correct image. If you want some more accurate calibration that can also take display panel inconsistencies into account, you could use a colorimeter like the X-Rite i1 Display Pro and some calibration software like the free-to-download DisplayCal to generate a 3D lookup table. Both monitors let you import lookup tables from SD cards and have 8 internal slots to store them. However, you might want to use lookup tables for different purposes than calibration. With the Andycine C7, you are out of options at this point. You can only use a calibration LUT or, for instance, a color space transform LUT that transforms your camera's color profile to something like Rec. 709, but you can't use both at the same time. The Shinobi does give you an additional option to use color space transforms in addition to lookup tables. However, it only has a very limited range of camera profiles to choose from for this. I myself, for instance, have a Blackmagic camera, and Blackmagic doesn't even show up in the camera manufacturers you can choose from. If you happen to have a color space transform lookup table at hand, and also an X-Rite I1 Display Pro, and a special cable for that, you can download the Atomos calibration software to calibrate the Shinobi independently from camera profiles and lookup tables. However, since that's a lot of prerequisites, and as I said, color perception also depends a lot on the viewing environment, I'm not going to give a point to either of the monitors in this category. Alright, I think we've got all other categories covered, so let's get to the last one, bang for the buck. The Shinobi does seem to be a little more accurate at everything than the C7. However, it is also about $100 more expensive and has a smaller panel. Both monitors are definitely targeted at the low-budget market, where I honestly don't think that the little bit of extra accuracy that you get out of the Shinobi matters that much. Therefore, this category clearly goes to the Andycine C7. Anyway, as I said, you should make your own buying decision based on what categories matter the most to you. I hope this video will help you do that, and I guess I'll see you the next time I'll upload something to YouTube, whenever that will be.